Thank God we're sober. Okay, I think we're about ready to start, so if everyone grabs their seats. I'm Ryan Heath from Politico, and welcome to this second Playbook Breakfast, including to all of you who are watching online. I think there's actually many thousands, so more than in the room, who are watching online right now. And I think, if you agree, Nigel, let's try and crash a few servers this morning over the next hour. The hashtag is Playbook Breakfast if you do want to have the online conversation, and there'll be feedback forms at the end of the event as well. And the aim with these sorts of events is to keep it a lively conversation, not only between us, but also involving all of you. So think of dialogues, not diatribes, when you come up with your inputs. Now, with me on stage is Mr. Nigel Farage. He's the leader of the UK Independence Party, aka the Tea Party with actual tea. And he's one of the leading faces of Euroscepticism. So you could say we have a full English breakfast this morning, or as one of my colleagues said, a breakfast. So, but that depends on you, Mr. Farage. But it's not only English, because Nigel loves German women, he loves Spanish wine, he loves Italian food, he loves Belgian beer, and he drives Swedish cars. So we've established that he likes Europe, but he also hates the EU. So I think that's going to come up in the discussion.
I agree entirely with that analysis.
And by extension, and this makes it a lot more fun, by hating the EU, he also hates a lot of the work that many of you do each day. So it's going to be a fun next hour, I can promise you that. But Playbook doesn't just deal with the policies, we're interested in understanding the people behind the policies. So we know that you love a drink, we know that you're witty, we know that you're a YouTube sensation.
Well, thank you for providing me with a bar stool. I mean, I feel quite at home, actually. I did ask for an ashtray, but that's all been banned now, but never mind.
But one thing a lot of people don't realize about you is that you've had 3 brushes with death. You had cancer at 21, you had a serious car crash, and then an even more spectacular plane crash. So I'm interested to know, how does that change you as a person? How does it change you as a politician to go through that?
Well, it makes me feel very lucky. I mean, crikey, you know. I mean, in some ways, the car crash was even more dramatic than the plane crash. You know, I was really smashed to pieces. I mean, I'm a bit like Barry Sheen. I've been reconstructed, you know. I think if you do have some big shocks in life, you go one of 2 ways. I remember after the car crash, and then I was diagnosed with cancer. And I was sitting in a hospital in London having had major surgery for cancer. And I had Channel 4 racing on, a small scotch on the go and a cigar, and the phone onto the bookmakers, at which point my oncologist came into the room and stared at me. And he said, young men that go through a shock like this often spend the rest of their lives drinking carrot juice. He said, some go the other way. I suspect you're a member of the latter category. So I've just, you know, ever since all that went wrong at 21, I've just basically lived at 100 miles an hour. The devil take the hindmost, get on with things. And I don't know, I genuinely don't really care what people think of me, which is probably just as well being in UKIP. And so I've just got on with life and not worried about the consequences. Yep. So I think probably those shocks that I had early have made quite a big difference. I think otherwise I would have stayed in the commodities business. You know, I wouldn't have gone into politics, probably made loads of money, but it's been much more exciting doing this.
Exactly. So aside from the extra fun and the extra work that's been involved, I mean, well, actually, no, let's get back to the work. It's a slog. I mean, we've got some things in common. I get up at 4:30 in the morning to make my Playbook column happen, and you did that for years as well. We both work in different cities on different days. You know, basically, it's just a hard slog if you're out there questioning the EU all of the time. I mean, is it taking a toll on you? What do you do?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, the first 5 years, I was elected here in '99, which is a long time ago, and I turned up here. I was young, dark-haired, shy. No, that's not true. I wasn't shy. But the first 5 years, I didn't do very much here at all. You know, I sat up in the gods. There was very limited speaking opportunities. I also overlapped that with running a business and employing people. But since '04, you know, I've been doing this full time, and, you know, it is 7 days a week. There is absolutely no escape from it. Does it take a toll? Well, it must take a bit of a toll, mustn't it? But you know, we've got a referendum. The UK is going to have a referendum on our membership of the European Union, and I genuinely don't think that if I hadn't done what I'd done, with the support of many people in UKIP, that wouldn't have happened. So I'm actually up for this next fight in a bigger way than anything I've ever engaged with before. And I think we can win the referendum.
So in a way, you've almost answered my next question, which was to remind you of a comment that you made before the 2015 election, where you said...
I made quite a few comments before that election that I came to regret, but anyway,
That's also true. And one of them was to say, look, I won't have any credibility staying as the leader if I don't win a seat at Westminster. And that didn't work out. So can you tell us why you've got credibility now?
Well, I think at the time, you know, I thought it was perfectly reasonable to think that UKIP would win a number of seats in the House of Commons, and if I'd not been one of them, I think that would have been very, very difficult. I think, you know, we got 4.4 million votes in 2014, won the European elections.
Yes.
We came into a general election where about 40% of those who voted for us in 14 didn't vote for us. Nearly a couple of million people went and voted Conservative, chiefly because they feared the Scottish National Party, and they thought Ed, frankly, wasn't up to the job. And yet we still got 4 million votes because we supplemented with people who hadn't voted in their lives, and we bit very hard into Labour in the Midlands and the North. And I think in retrospect, I mean, if you'd said to me a year ago, there's going to be a dramatic swing to the Tories will get a majority, which, by the way, was 13-2 against the day before the election at Ladbrokes. You know, the Tories are going to get a majority, and despite all of this, UKIP's still going to get 4 million votes. Frankly, I'd have bitten your arm off. So, yeah, we were disappointed, you know, and the first past the post system was brutal, but all in all, I think we can, as a party, hold our heads held pretty high.
And I guess, in a sense, you're sort of the ultimate outsider, but having been around a while, that tag fades a little bit. You know, in my head, I imagined that, you know, you are to Anglophone politics and to Euroscepticism a bit as Rupert Murdoch is to the Anglophone media world and to that sort of establishment. But you can't hold that outsider status forever, especially when you do things like win the European election. So how is that adjusting the way you have to play the game?
I've been considered an outsider. I've been considered a maverick, an extremist, but now, no longer. We've got Jeremy Corbyn. I'm mainstream now. Well, I mean, whether I like it or not. It's quite interesting. There was a big piece of polling over the weekend done by YouGov asking where the public put political leaders on the left-right spectrum, 50 being in the middle. Jeremy Corbyn came up with -80, which is remarkably out on the left. David Cameron was 53, and I was 62. So all this idea that, you know, UKIP is considered to be hard right and toxic isn't borne out, and you know, that is not what people think. When you challenge a status quo position, whether it's in politics or business or science, you know, you are always, to begin with, ignored, then you're made fun of, then you get the vicious level of attack, but if you're right, in the end, you win. And I think we're on the edge of something quite dramatic happening in this British referendum. There is a massive sea change in opinion that has taken place since May of this year. And
Jeremy Corbyn is no threat in that respect.
Well, I mean, Mr. Corbyn, I mean, sincerely, I would love to have shared a platform with Mr. Corbyn in the referendum, despite the fact we disagree on almost everything. And in general, my relationship with vegetarian teetotalers isn't good. But I would love to have shared a platform with him, but I'm afraid that the Labour Party has become so Europhile that he's now decided he's not going to campaign on this issue, and that's a bit of a shame.
Yep. But now, as someone who provokes extreme reactions, I wanted to get a sense of why you think that is. So you obviously have an adoring fan base and this real ability to connect with different people across classes. So that must have been a bit of a factor in you staying on, because you are so central to that image of UKIP. And then, of course, you've got this whole political establishment that, you know, not to put it too fine a point on it, you know, essentially they hate you at some level.
Oh, yeah.
You know, to paraphrase Juncker after the State of the Union, it was almost a sort of, he was saying you were almost subhuman, you weren't worthy of a reaction, and yet he was reacting.
Well, I think it's important.
Why do you think you get that reaction?
No, I think it's important in life to be judged by your enemies, and looking at the people lined up against me, I reckon I'm probably in the right place, you know. Look, why am I disliked so much in Brussels? Well, that's because I want most of these people fired. You know, it's why if I walk into Kitty O'Shea's, the whole bloody place goes silent, you know. I don't see the need for all of this apparatus. I don't think we want a political state, effectively a country called Europe. I don't think we need a flag, an anthem. I don't think we need a European Commission. Do I think we need some sensible form of European cooperation, perhaps based on the original founding principles of the Council of Europe, late 1940s? Yes, of course. I think we do live in the same time zone. There are genuine cross-border issues that require cooperation. I'm genuinely not anti-European. That would be absolutely a moronic position to take. But I view this whole apparatus that has been built up as being unnecessary. And so, let's be honest. A lot of people in this room who are earning good money, paying a top rate of tax of 16%. A middle ranker in this city working for the Parliament or the Commission earns more than the British Prime Minister. So I'm not surprised a lot of you hate me.
That's a very interesting point.
Well, come on, you can be a bit ruder to me. I don't mind.
So was it always that way? I got the impression that you always wanted the UK out of the EU, but at some point in Brussels you decided you viscerally hate the place.
Yeah, when I came here in 1999, I believed Britain was a square peg in a round hole. A long tradition of parliamentary democracy, a system of common law, a series of relationships across the world through the Commonwealth, our own kith and kin in many of these countries, and I thought it was completely mad to have turned our back on the Anglosphere in the way that we'd done. So when I came here, I just thought, look, let's get Britain out of this. Let's have a simple free trade agreement, which is what my parents thought they were voting for 40 years ago. But if south of Calais, this is what everybody wants, then it's up to them. Let them get on with it. That was my view in 1999. What changed me was the events of 2005, when we had the Constitution. We had the Constitution. We had the referendum in France, and we then had the referendum in the Netherlands. And I remember that night, the night of the result. There were about 120 of us in the press bar in the Parliament here. And at 9 o'clock, the result came out. It was a resounding 2-1 rejection of the Constitution. And I genuinely, corks started popping and big party. And I genuinely thought, we've changed it. We have changed it. They will now have to start moving back in the other direction. They'll have to start giving power back to the member states. And I remember at that moment of elation seeing a socialist German MEP, Joe Leinen, who was walking down the corridor, going off to do an interview, and I said to him, do you want to come and join us for a drink to celebrate the Dutch result? Well, I wasn't expecting necessarily a particularly polite reply. But he looked at me, he said, you may have your little celebration. We have 50 different ways to win. And on he went. I thought, crikey. And within a fortnight, they'd rebranded the Constitution, the Lisbon Treaty. D'Amato, the former Italian Prime Minister, boasted that because it was going to be called a treaty and not a constitution, it wouldn't need referendums. They didn't surrender a single power, and they carried on regardless. And ever since that moment, I have hated them.
Now, regardless of what it's called, it doesn't seem to have been much use in the real topic of the day, which is migration and the refugee crisis that we've been facing. So you might say, you can look at it from two different ends of the spectrum, but you can say that when it comes to things like the migration crisis, that's really a best-case example of how the EU isn't working. But Britain is out of that refugee and that migration policy, and it doesn't seem to be working much better either. So, what do you think of how David Cameron and Theresa May have been handling that, and what does this whole crisis say about the EU to you?
Well, from the start, I tried to make this an issue back in April, as they were about to implement the EU's common asylum policy, which had been drafted back in 2013. And I said in that speech to Juncker in April, I said, the way you have set the bounds and definitions for who qualifies for asylum is much wider than the 1951 Geneva Convention. You're basically saying to the whole world, all you have to do is put one foot on European soil, and that's fine. And I said then, it will lead to an exodus of biblical proportions. So the policy is completely wrong, and the policy has directly encouraged people to go into the hands of the criminal traffickers, and we all talk about the photograph of that boy dead on the beach, which had a big impact on public opinion. But we should be seeing 3,000 photographs like that. There are 3,000 people that have drowned this year, and I think EU policy is directly responsible for it. The Australians faced a very similar problem. The Australians dealt with it differently. The Australians said, if you want to apply to be a refugee, you do so at an offshore processing centre. If you arrive by boat, you won't be allowed to stay.
But they locked a lot of people up in the desert as well. Some of them are still sitting there. So would you want the same thing to happen here to achieve your end?
Australia has incurred massive criticism from other leaders around the world, but people have stopped drowning, and that's worth thinking about. For the Brits, well, we're outside. We're outside the common asylum policy. We get the knock-on effect, of course, of Calais, which has been a running sore over the course of the summer. But ultimately, it doesn't really make any difference, because if 800,000 people go to Germany, and if in 18 months' time they all get German passports, they can all come to Britain anyway.
So what should Britain do? Like, let's work from the starting point.
Well, what Britain should do is very simple. I mean, I think that the one thing that Cameron has done right is to say, and he's clearly listening. He clearly is listening to the debate, but to say we won't encourage people to come by boat across the Mediterranean, absolutely bang on. To say that Britain would provide room for some genuine refugees, yes, I agree with that. The only minor concern I have is that basically what Cameron has done pretty much excludes any Christians from coming. It's very interesting, because Mr. Juncker, my great mate, at least he's got a sense of humour, which you couldn't say for Barroso. But Mr. Juncker said in his State of the Union speech, this must not have anything to do with religion. Really? Surely the French Huguenots, who were refugees, were about religion. Surely the German and Russian Jews were about religion.
We shouldn't be designing a policy that discriminates between religions.
Well, if you think about what a genuine refugee is, on the 1951 definition of it, it is somebody who fears direct persecution as a result of their race, class, religion, political beliefs, or orientation. And
which covers pretty much everyone who's in the range of ISIS, isn't it? It's
not
really specific.
Well, no, it doesn't include. It doesn't include coming from a war-torn region as such. It is people who are genuinely in fear of persecution, and I just feel that the Christians have been rather ignored. And for Christians in Iraq and Syria, life has become pretty impossible. Overall, it's a tick for David Cameron for trying to do this the right way.
Okay, and how? I feel we get stuck in generalities sometimes here. So you say we should take some refugees, and Cameron's put the figure at 20,000. I mean, how many can a rich, proud, strong country like Britain actually take?
We're having this debate. Is 4,000 people a year the right number? I would suggest that's an irrelevant debate compared with the fact that 642,000 people settled in Britain last year. And that's the real debate we should be having. UKIP has always said we will give help to genuine refugees.
So let's switch away to something that might be less controversial, but it's definitely something you know a lot about. Lord Jonathan Hill, who is the British Commissioner here in Brussels.
I know.
He's launching his Capital Markets Union plan today. Now, you know the city, you've worked in the city, you've employed people in the city. Is that going to help the city, or is it just more proof of, in your words, that the EU is simply unable to reform, like that it is unreformable? Well,
just a word about Jonathan Hill, the British Commissioner. If we dragged 1,000 people off the streets of London and put Hill in a lineup, not one single person would even know who he was, which is remarkable. This sort of facelessness that now goes with the Brussels bureaucracy. He's a perfectly pleasant chap, but not been elected, can't be removed, no one knows who he is. The city, I worked in the city, I worked in the commodities business, I worked in metals, London Metal Exchange, copper, lead, tin, aluminium, zinc, and nickel was what we traded. The LME was the epicenter for the global marketplace. Lots of, the Americans, Shanghai, lots of people had tried to build metal exchanges, but none surpassed London. It was truly global in everything that it did. It was absolutely tariff-free, unless you imported aluminium into Europe, and then there was a 7% surcharge. And I grew up, on that exchange in the 1980s and 90s. When the phone rang, yeah, sure, it could be Paris, and it could be Frankfurt, but it was just as likely to be Singapore or Santiago. And that's why the city has done well. It's done well because of its global dimension. Europe is a part of that, and I frankly see within these institutions a loathing of what is considered to be Anglo-Saxon capitalism, which sort of, the economic geniuses like Guy Verhofstadt think that it's the evil Anglo-Saxons that have led to a bond spread differential between Greece and Germany. And what I see coming down the tracks, on top of what we've had already, is just a massive legislation that increasingly makes the city uncompetitive. The AIFM directive saw 25% of our hedge funds leave within 12 months. Just go. You know, some went to Zurich, and they may come back. A lot went to Singapore. They'll never come back.
Now, some others disagree with you there on that point. So
well,
I think in your book you said
that
from 2010, a quarter of them left.
Yeah.
But the Brits didn't even put that into law until July in 2013.
No, but it's the signal. Yep. It's the signal. You know,
okay.
Businesses get a signal that they're not really wanted, and they move. We've similarly seen much of the reinsurance business leave London and go to Bermuda. Not a bad place to go, I suppose. But, you know,
So Hill can't change it. He's playing at the edges, and it's not really going to make a difference.
The city is important. I mean, clearly it's Britain's biggest industry, and it's important. Of course, the Goldman Sachses will always say we should stay inside the European Union. It's not surprising. I mean, they get to appoint prime ministers and things like that. But actually, you know, at the ground level, at the trading, broking, and investment level, I think there's a massive shift of opinion. And you only have to read what the commentators are now saying. People saying, look, we've always been in favour of a European single market. Actually, it doesn't work anyway. We still find it very difficult to sell insurance products in Germany or whatever it may be. And if after 30 years of attempting to build a single market, it doesn't actually work anyway, and it's bringing us added regulatory costs, what's the point of being there?
No. Now, someone like Franz Timmermans would probably agree with a lot of your criticisms. And in fact, he's trying to cut out a lot of EU laws, and you've said you've been quite impressed by him. So are you actually afraid he might succeed?
I think he's the most dangerous man in Europe. I think he's... no, I do.
Write that one down.
Yeah, no. I mean, he's fiercely intelligent, speaks English better than most English people, is very good at making this deregulatory argument. And I've no doubt in the run-up to the British referendum there will be a substantial amount of window dressing to try and show that they've deregulated by bundling up directives and things like that. But I don't think anybody seriously thinks that the European Commission is about to shed lots of the acquis communautaire. I just don't believe it.
Alrighty. Now, one of the other things we do in this breakfast series is we do a bit of rapid-fire questioning, a sort of yes or no, one or two word answer. So we're going to move into that now. So, is it true that you've never sent an email?
That's not true, but I try not to.
Okay.
I just think, you know, I mean, look, I've benefited politically from social media more than anybody. You know, I mean, YouTube, all of that stuff, and actually, if you look at UKIP's level of online engagement, you know, through Facebook, Twitter, and everything else, it is really the main method by which our party
it helps you bypass the mainstream media.
But as soon as you start sitting down on a computer doing emails, you suddenly stop talking to people and meeting people. So I prefer to meet people.
Okay. Now, who does more to slow down European integration, you or the European Council?
Well, I'd like to think it's me, but with the best will in the world, you know, whenever I stand up and try to post them, I tend to get steamrolled. So I think it's the European Council, and wasn't it interesting? Mr. Orban and 3 other countries said no at a European Council meeting, and then we saw, you know, this rapidly produced piece of legislation ushered through the European Parliament, pushed through by qualified majority vote. If ever you wanted an indication of why the European Union isn't just undemocratic, but it's anti-democratic, it was that.
Now, which commissioner, living or dead, do you least want to be stuck in an elevator with?
Crikey. Well,
and you can only say one.
Well, he wasn't a commissioner. He wasn't a commissioner, so I'm going to cheat a little bit if I can.
Okay.
But the thought of being stuck in a lift for 6 hours with Herman Van Rompuy does not fill me with a tremendous amount of glee. No doubt he'd start quoting his haikus at me. I'd probably have to slash my wrists.
Now, which commissioner, living or dead, would you most prefer to have a beer with?
Well, Mr. Juncker is an extraordinarily sociable chap.
Might have to be more than one beer.
He enjoys lunch, so do I. I have to say, I've got no personal enmity at all towards Juncker or Timmermans. I feel these are bright fellas. I disagree with them politically, but I quite like them. Of the commissioners I've seen over the years here, who would I most like to have a chat with? The Irish commissioner, Charlie McCreevy, was a great character, and I think he actually did understand some of the flaws in this project.
Okay.
As for the British commissioners, none of them. None of them.
Thatcher or Reagan?
Oh, I mean, I just have... I think that, you know, what Ronnie did was radical and remarkable, but entirely doable in America. I think what Thatcher did in Britain was almost unthinkable. It was unthinkable in 1978 that a prime minister would come in and be as radical as she was, and that took enormous courage. I didn't agree with all of it, of all of what she did, and there were some people who paid a very heavy price for it. But I genuinely think that 11 years after becoming prime minister, Britain was a country that had stopped hating rich people, and where there was genuine aspiration.
Uber or taxifare?
Well, frankly, this will get me in terrible trouble, but if you're in Brussels, and there are some very good taxi drivers in Brussels, but there are some very bad taxi drivers in Brussels. You know, where you get into the car, the music's playing loudly, they've no idea where they're going, and they still charge you a fortune. You may as well use Uber. In London, where the taxi driver has done, you know, a knowledge test that is unrivaled in the world, speaks the same language, which helps, knows where they're going, is very, very good at using initiative, as against Uber, where it's pretty doubtful whether the person driving the car is actually properly registered and paying tax. In London, it's the black cab and the higher fare every time. In Brussels, I have to say, unless the Brussels taxis smarten their acts up, Uber will obliterate them.
Now let's get into the heart of the Brexit discussions, because I'm getting the signal that we need to move to the Q&A, and we're definitely moving to a Q&A, but it would not be a Nigel Farage breakfast if we didn't get on to Brexit.
Yeah.
So, great. And we've got some questions from Twitter as well. So why don't we just run straight into this question. Okay. It's from Katie Owens. If the UK votes yes in the referendum, will you resign again?
Oh, but... there is no prospect of us voting to stay part of this undemocratic club. Look, all I can say, Katie, is I am going to throw my heart and soul into getting Britain to divorce itself from political union, and I genuinely now think we can win this referendum.
And how are you going to get there? You're going to have to build bridges somehow. So who are the Tories that you respect? Who are the ones that you can do business with to make this actually happen?
I'm sure there are lots of them.
But some names. You must know some of them.
Well, I haven't seen many yet. But I mean, look, the current Tory Eurosceptic position appears to be exemplified by John Redwood, which is let's wait and see what David Cameron comes back with, which is a ridiculous position to be in. Yeah. We're not asking for anything fundamental. We're not asking for treaty change. And if we allow Cameron to set his own agenda, then to come back crying victory, then he might win. So let's see. But there will be quite a lot of Tory MPs. And a couple of MEPs who will vote to leave. There'll be some in the Labour Party, but I'm not actually convinced that it's politicians necessarily that are going to win the day.
Exactly, but there are grassroots campaigns. So there's your Leave.eu.
Yep.
There is the one calling itself the Out campaign. Tell us a bit about why there's tension between those two groups, and are you going to be able to overcome?
I mean, look,
how's that going to work?
Look, we are the political party that is united in wanting Britain to vote to leave, and I've launched my roadshow, and with my MEP colleagues. We've got 300 meetings planned up and down the country. I've done my first 3 or 4. We're getting bigger audiences than we've ever seen before, and I'm going to go on doing that around the country, right up until the referendum. It's my sort of Billy Graham tour, if you like, of Euroscepticism.
Exactly. So you want to directly connect with people. You don't want talking shops. You don't want fancy slogans.
I see that as UKIP's role. Now, there will have to be an umbrella group that gets the official designation as being the Leave campaign. We have a group in Tufton Street in Westminster who have taken a long, long time, 6 months, to sort of finally make their minds up that they're for leaving the EU. I believe they're about to launch next week, and that's fine. That's fine. There's some very talented people in it. They produce very good research.
But you're just going to do your own thing.
You've got
enough faith in UKIP's approach.
Let me finish. I question their ability to reach out beyond Westminster, but I, no question they've got very good technical talents. Leave.eu is a different phenomenon. That is set up by Aaron Banks, Jim Mellon, and a series of entrepreneurs, and their idea is to connect, it's very similar to ours in a way, connect directly with the British public, and they have signed up 180,000 supporters in 5 weeks. That is pretty impressive. One of those two groups will get the designation. I see part of my role, I hope, that in the end, we can bring all those talents together. And there'll be one big umbrella, and UKIP will work with the umbrella, but we will be the ground campaign.
And one of the things you talk about in your autobiography is the importance of positive campaigning, that you don't believe in that sort of American attack ad approach. But then you've obviously got very severe criticisms of the EU. I mean, it's kind of an out-of-control monster in your view that doesn't work anyway, whatever its intent is. So how are you going to take that negative feeling and turn it into a positive campaign message?
Yeah, I mean, I don't like negative campaigning, although, you know, it has to be said that the Conservative Party won the general election on negative campaigning. Do you know, if you actually survey British public opinion about the EU, the feeling is already overwhelmingly negative anyway. You know, I don't need to tell people how ghastly Brussels is. There is no need. What we do need to do is to reassure people that post-membership, you know, we're going to go on doing business, but actually be freer and more independent to do business on a global stage. Now, actually, I stick to it. I'm going to be campaigning on the positives.
Yep. And let's do a quick pit stop for the morning after.
Yeah.
You win the referendum. It's everything you've ever wanted in your career.
I should feel pretty rotten the next morning, I've got to tell you.
Indeed. And one of the reasons you might feel rotten is you'll wake up and those 100,000 pages of EU law will still be on the books.
Yeah.
And you'll have to begin a 2-year negotiation to get them off the books or to come to some kind of treaty arrangement so that Britain actually leaves. How are you going to tackle that?
No, I mean, look, you know, once we are divorcing, you know, and we're heading, you know, we've got our decree nisi and we're heading up for the absolute. Yeah. That 100,000 pages of law, you know, has been put into British law already. It might take us years to go through that. Yeah. It might take us years to go through that and see which parts of it we think are generally sensible and which parts are excessive and costly. The important thing is to cut the future flow. Yep. Of that legislation. The important thing is for us to be free to start making our own deals on the world stage. And I think this argument, I mean, I rehearsed this with Clegg last year in the European elections. Nick said, Britain must be part of the EU so that we have clout to negotiate on the world stage. And I pointed out, Nick, Iceland, with 317,000 people, is quite capable of making trade deals with China or whomsoever we chooses. So I think it's a confidence thing. I mean, basically, for 40 years, most senior British politicians have just not thought Britain's good enough to do stuff on their own. We need to be part of a bigger club. And again, that's why, you know, the positive argument is we are good enough.
I'm not sure. If Cameron's not good enough to do a renegotiation, why is he good enough to run the country?
No, we are good enough as a people to run our country.
Okay.
Whether Dave is another question.
All right. I think on that note, it's time to bring all of you in. Look at that. We've got immediate questions. So I think I might start with this gentleman here in the blue tie, the young fellow in the check shirt. Then we need a female hand. So over here. Then we'll turn to this lady over here, and I won't forget you. I will come back to you on this side of the audience. So please begin.
Thank you. Petri Saroma, MEP, First Vice Chair of the Budgets Committee, EPP. Your recollection and your take on the anti-democratic features of the Union are understandable, to say the least. I am very frustrated myself many times, but since I believe that you have a big influence beyond Britain, so you are not responsible only for how the British will then finally decide, but so I want to ask on behalf of, if I'm allowed, on behalf of the other 27 member states and their citizens, since you really we have a foreign minister in my member state who is preaching pretty much the same teachings and was inspired by you. Since I say that the European Union is needed actually exactly because of the same reasons that it's not functioning very well, which is that the nation states and the history tells us that we are better off having this very imperfect union than we would be without one. So if you would be responsible for the 500 million people and their in their lives, because we look at the history, it's really it's awful. So how do you answer to this? I mean, we all know the problems, we all know what's wrong with the union, but if we just get rid of it, then what would we have?
Well, I mean, I'm going to sort of take issue a bit with your historical analysis. I mean, what example do you have in history of a whole series of free nations willingly giving up, well, no, we'll come to war in a second, willingly, giving up their ability to govern themselves to an unelected cabal in a foreign city? It just doesn't happen. And actually, all over the world, at the very same time that Europe has politically been heading towards a union, the rest of the world is going in the opposite direction. There are more and more new countries spawned every single year. The principles of national self-determination, self-government, people wanting their own identity. That's the post-war story, apart from Europe. Now look, war. 3 times in 70 years, the French and Germans are bashing hell out of each other, with massive consequences for everybody, in Europe and indeed across the world. And the desire to get people together, to trade together, to be friends together, was an utterly sensible thing to be doing. But actually, when people say to me, oh, but the European Union has created peace, well, what are we saying? Are we saying the Germans are so evil that they would have re-invaded in 1958 or 1968? I don't think anybody seriously thinks that. I don't think post-1945, I think there was zero appetite in Germany for war or for geographical expansionism. And far from being a project of peace, just look at the way the north and south of Europe now feel about each other and talk about each other. Just look at what the European Union did in the Ukraine, by actually deliberately, through expansionism, EU expansionism, saying we want the Ukraine to be part of the European Union, we want the Ukraine to be a member of NATO, and actually deliberately provoking the overthrow. You may have been corrupt, but the overthrow of an elected leader. I do not see the European Union going on from here as being a project of peace. And indeed, Tony Blair was very good on this. He was asked that basic peace question. And Blair said, about 2 years ago, Blair said the European Union used to be about peace, now it is about power. And I think Mr. Blair was right. So I think the way for us to be peaceful in Europe, which is the number one priority for all of us, and I agree with that, is to have genuinely independent, democratic, sovereign states working and trading together. Clubs like NATO, free trade associations, let's do all of those things. But the idea that we surrender our independence to a higher authority, and that's going to make us happy forever, I don't buy it. It goes against human nature, in my view.
Thanks. I want to make you a question about a topic that is dividing Europe more than you. How do you think, who is defending the public citizens' interest of British and Europe in the topic of TTIP? You or the European Commission?
TTIP. Well, yeah, interesting, isn't it? I mean, I've always thought of myself as a free trader, but I look at TTIP, and I think to myself, well, this isn't just about removing barriers to trade. This is actually about regulation. It's actually about harmonisation, and it's about a disputes mechanism that goes over and above the ability of national parliaments and national courts to make decisions. And so I'm opposed to TTIP. And TTIP is very interesting and may well play a big role in the British referendum. 38 Degrees, a campaigning group in Britain, very well organised, got a massive emailing list, highly effective. 38 Degrees were the ones that started to push through the trade union movement and the centre-left in British politics a concern that the European Union was becoming a corporatist racket. Now, this is the sort of language that Tony Benn used in the referendum 40 years ago, and I'm beginning to think he might have been right. And I, as an MEP, received more letters, more emails, more phone calls about TTIP than any subject in the 16 and a half years that I've been in Brussels. So there is an awakening in the centre-left of British politics that something very odd is going on. And I think that, I suspect that TTIP's going to be shelved, actually, until after the British referendum.
I've got a good follow-up there, actually. And so UKIP was very vocal yesterday on the closure of a steelworks in Redcar, a British town on the east coast of England. and I'll be really honest with you, I think you were maybe overplaying the effect that the EU might have had on that situation. But there was one very interesting element.
Go on.
Well, I mean, it was as if the EU had swarmed in and decided to raise the steelwork. So there might, I think, be a bit of exaggeration there. But one of the other issues that was acknowledged in all of that UKIP press material was Chinese dumping. And now there's another issue that's coming on the table in Brussels, which is whether to grant China market economy status, which would make it much harder to run anti-dumping cases. It feeds into many of those same TTIP fears. Do you have an opinion about what we should do with China then?
Look, I think we need to be honest with ourselves. Our obsession in Brussels with carbon dioxide, our total obsession that this is the great evil, as opposed to genuine pollution, has led to lots of things, Volkswagen being one of them. But really, what we haven't focused on is our energy is too blooming expensive. As we, through the modern equivalent of the Corn Laws, take money from the poor, add costs to our manufacturers to give money to rich landowners. I think, frankly, wind energy, I think it is the most flawed policy I've seen in my lifetime. And Redcar's original problem was caused, actually, when Mittal pulled out, a few years ago, because, and they made it perfectly clear, the manufacturing was relocating to India. So even if you were concerned about emissions, it's a zero-sum game. In fact, perhaps actually, given that a lot of the product gets exported back to Europe, in fact, the effect of it is even more carbon dioxide put into the atmosphere. So that was the beginning of Redcar's problems, and we now face, is a British government allowed to intervene to help a, short-term help a failing industry? Well, it looks to be against EU rules, though I've no doubt if it was France we were talking about, they would just ignore it and do it. The issue of China is a difficult one, but should we give the market economy state? I think we probably should, yes.
Okay. Over to the lady here in the second row.
Good morning, Sarah Ryan from Vodafone Group. If you succeed in gaining your divorce, I'm going to be one of the children of your broken home. So I work a lot here, but I'm Irish and I'm based in London. So I'm curious, will you be kicking me and my hundreds of international colleagues out of London if Britain leaves the EU? And what about the Brits based here? What's your plan for them?
You seem to be assuming that because we're not in the European Union, all trade will cease. You seem to assume that I'm going to be pretty. I want.
I hope we're not trafficking Sarah.
Are you assuming that I want? I'm not talking about brain guns on the cliffs of Dover. I'm talking about us going on. We will go on doing business the day after we've left the referendum, exactly as we do, the day before the referendum. Well, anybody that legally has come to Britain would never face any retrospective change of law. However, going on, do I think it's sustainable to have borderless Britain? Do I think it's sensible to allow 642,000 people to settle in our country last year? Could be 1 million next year, with absolutely no control over the quantity or the quality of who comes to Britain. And where I want us to go is, if we do genuinely need foreign workers, fine, use work permits. Countries all over the world do this. And a work permit entitles you to come to work, but it doesn't entitle you to the National Health Service. And you certainly wouldn't be allowed to come if you had a criminal record. And I ultimately want Britain to have an Australian-style point system so that we have a skills-based immigration policy. And that's the right way forward. And I'm sure that as somebody vastly paid by Vodafone, you would tick all of the right boxes.
Can I double-check one point there, Nigel? I'll inject myself in for a second.
Yeah.
So I lived in London for 4 years. I have only an Australian passport. I've been in Europe for 12 years. So I never had access to any social security in the sense of unemployment benefits, housing, etc. It was always written on my visa, you can't have any of that. But one thing I did have access to was the NHS. So are you actually saying that people with work permits shouldn't therefore have access to those?
I mean, if I want to go to Australia to set, well, I'm too old now, but you've got to be under the age of 45, you've got to have a skill or a trade, you've got to prove in Australia.
But we wouldn't turn you away at the doctor, I don't think.
Well, they would if you had a criminal record. The Australians are very strict about this. They used to welcome people with criminal records years ago, but that's all. But that appears to have all changed.
A cheap shot.
Yeah, I enjoyed it, and we won.
We're going to get you on back on Saturday at the Rugby World Cup.
And we won the Ashes as well. So but the rugby, actually, I fear you're right. So no, I mean, but I think that is look. The first 20 years of membership of this European club the issue of free movement was a non-issue. It was a non-issue because the countries we were involved with had roughly similar educational standards, roughly similar health standards, roughly similar levels of average wages. There were differences, but they weren't huge. The big mistake was enlarging the Union and letting in a lot of post-communist countries who were very much poorer. And to say, there was free movement within that regime has been a terrible mistake, not just for my country, but when you go to some of those Baltic countries that had really done well in the 1990s, good growth rates, they've lost all their best people. All their young doctors, all their young accountants have left and have come to London or Berlin or whatever it is. So I think the overnight opening up of the doors has really had pretty harmful consequences.
Now we turn to this side of the room. There were 3 or 4 people. Are these 2 gentlemen here, first in the yellow tie, then in the blue shirt, and then over here in the edge?
Well, I don't need to introduce myself to Nigel. We go back to '99.
Morning, Charles.
Good morning, Nigel. I remember a younger Nigel who wasn't very active in his first mandate here. He was quite honest about that. And you said you were a lucky man, Nigel. Well, clearly you are lucky. I think the migration crisis is a gift to UKIP right now. Merkel's unwise signals of an open door, clearly encouraging more people to make the hazardous passage, has obviously affected the opinion polls, which are now swinging towards Brexit. I mean, I'm one of the Tories who will almost undoubtedly be campaigning to stay in, but I agree that, as it were, we now have an additional problem of trying to stabilise the external borders and bring peace to Syria. And clearly the EU is not responsible for the poverty of the world or the civil war in Syria. So I think you have been lucky. But I'd love to know how, for instance, you think a Brexit would solve the problem of Calais. The Le Touquet Treaty, for instance, would probably be abrogated, repealed, and the border would move back to the British side of the Channel, and people would just go walking through the tunnel. Why are you suggesting we close down the Channel Tunnel?
Okay, I think one more question.
No.
We've already got 2.
2 more questions.
Okay.
First of all, you mentioned that the foreign policies had nothing to do with peace. Well, I am the rapporteur for Montenegro. I can assure you in the Western Balkans, EU membership has actually been the glue which has bound that part of the world in peace and some prosperity. Take that away, you destabilise the Balkans again and destabilise the whole of Europe if Brexit occurs. And I think there could be really a risk of war breaking out in unstable parts of our continent. And you mentioned the Anglosphere. You name me one Commonwealth or US leader who's in favour of a Brexit. I've never met a foreign minister from Canada or Australia saying they want us out, because they actually regard this as a force for good, in spite of all its faults, as was said by our Finnish colleague. And my last question, Nigel, if Brexit goes the wrong way and the UK votes to stay, will you respect the outcome? Will you make it work, or will UKIP just vanish off the face of the earth if you lose the referendum?
Well, there's a whole load of questions there. And by the way, well done, Charles. You're still working to build the European empire and to expand it. It's been a Tory policy since the mid-1980s, and it's been wrong at every single juncture. The Thatcher idea that a wider Europe would not mean a deeper Europe, actually, it's become wider and deeper at the same time. Look, you've asked a whole load of questions there. I think, you're right, that the migration crisis has made a difference over the last 6 months to public opinion, but there's something else that's made a big difference, and it's this. We had expected, those on my side of the debate, we had expected almost every big commercial company to say that if Britain leaves the EU, trade will cease, it'll be a disaster. Actually, what the bosses of the big car firms are saying, what increasingly the bosses of even some of the big city firms are saying, is if Britain leaves the European Union, it makes no difference at all to the investment strategy of people from outside investing in the country. And we're beginning to get a diet of this every single week. And that also is helping people to realise...
But that plays both ways, to be fair, doesn't
Yes, it does. But the old fear that 3 million British jobs will be threatened if we weren't in the European Union, that actually is diminishing by the day. As for the referendum, Charles, can I just say this? Cameron tried to stitch this up in every way. And I think we have to give absolutely full marks, by the way, to Business for Britain in Tufton Street, who I said earlier are very capable. They and Tory backbench MPs have managed to get the PERDA rules changed, which is great. The Electoral Commission, who've been utterly useless ever since they've been set up, although have done their very best to close down UKIP, but they've finally done something decent and changed the question, so we now have a fair and balanced question. And remarkably, the Conservative Party board has now decided that the Conservative Party will be neutral as a party in this campaign. So the Cameron stitch-up is beginning to unravel. I think there's been I genuinely think the tide's turned. And I do think, however much the other side try and use fear, I do think actually people want something different. They've had enough of it. I think we are going to vote to leave. If we lose the referendum, what will I do? Well, you know, of course, I would hate to look like the SNP, where you want to have another referendum 18 months on. And lastly, because there are a lot of questions there, would losing the referendum be the end of UKIP? Well, everybody thought when the Scottish National Party lost the referendum in Scotland, it was the end of the SNP, and actually what happened was they went on to completely dominate Scottish politics. I suspect that this referendum is going to have longer-term consequences for the shape of the Conservative Party and Labour Party and British politics than anybody right now realises. The 75 referendum, where Wilson had a very split party, the wounds never healed. And the SDP was a direct result, if you like, of that referendum and of that debate. So I think longer term, I think a realignment of British politics is coming, almost whatever the result.
Gentleman in the blue shirt, the lady in the middle, and then the final question over here, the man in the glasses.
Thank you. Stefano Stefanini, Atlantic Council. Say you've convinced me. You're going to win the referendum. What are you going to do the day after with Scotland? And you've shared your platform, say, with Jeremy Corbyn or with others, fellow travellers who are not like-minded. How are you going to share with them the spoils of victory?
But that's the point, isn't it? Once you return to being an independent, self-governing democracy, people who've shared platforms together can then get back to arguing viciously with each other, but knowing that actually the ultimate source of law is what comes in Westminster. I'm not pretending that just because we leave the European Union, overnight, all of Britain's economic and social ills will be cured. They won't. But we will have the ability to make those laws and to get those decisions right. And that's the point of it. Do we believe in democracy as a concept, yes or no? In the end, that's what this is all about. Do we think that our vote at elections matters, or have we become all like the Greeks, where it doesn't matter, or indeed the Hungarians, where it doesn't matter? I mean, this project is anti-democratic, and my argument will be that countries are better and happier and more self-confident if they are self-governing democracies, if the people themselves have the power to be the masters of their own destiny. Doesn't mean we'll always have good governments, of course not, but it does mean that we'll be in charge. And this concept of democracy is something that those that went before us thought was so fundamentally important that they actually went to war to defend that very principle. And modern-day politicians are quite happy, it seems, to throw this out with the bathwater as if it doesn't matter. A self-confident Europe of democratic nation-states trading together, cooperating together, being friends together, but without flags, without anthems, and without armies, I think is a better, brighter prospect. And I think if Britain does vote to leave, and I believe we will now, I think the knock-on effect in all of the countries of Europe will be huge. And I very much hope in 10 years' time there is no European Union. I hope it's been replaced by something far more sensible.
Now we move here.
So my name's Catherine Armitage. I've recently moved to Brussels, and I also volunteer for a Brussels-based Yes campaign group for the referendum called Pro-Europa. On the question of the democratic nature of the EU, as far as I understand, as someone who's recently moved here, UKIP MEPs are notorious in Brussels for their absence. Similarly, the Centre for European Reform recently published a report showing that Westminster doesn't really scrutinise EU laws as much as other EU countries do. So how can you say that the EU is anti-democratic or undemocratic when your own party rejects the opportunity to influence and participate in the laws that are made here?
Well, it's a lovely try, thank you. I normally get this from Verhofstadt, you know, in his more lucid moments, who oh, Mr. Farage is the most highly paid politician in the world because he never turns up. And you examine his own record, his committee he attended twice in 1 year. Actually, there are a couple of people in this room who are amongst the highest attending and voting British MEPs, both in plenary and in committee. So I won't have that. My own record of attendance is lower. My own record of votes is much lower, but I do lead a national political party. It's quite difficult, to do it all. But frankly, how much UKIP are here or not isn't really relevant, because we always get outvoted anyway. So I'm not going to buy that criticism. So the UK Parliament doesn't scrutinise properly. What's the point of scrutinising it properly? Ultimately, European law is superior over British law. European courts in Luxembourg and in Strasbourg, more often than not, staffed by people who aren't even judges, but jurists, overrules our Supreme Court. The whole business of scrutiny of EU legislation in Westminster, frankly, is a charade. It doesn't make any difference. And really, in a sense, that was the great lie of the 1970s. The great lie was that we weren't voting to be part of a free trade club, as my mum and dad thought we were. Actually, we were voting to join something where we were surrendering our sovereignty, literally, and surrendering our ability to make law and to judge our own law. And it's that I seek to reverse. And yes, when I first came here 15 years ago, that was considered to be an extreme position. Well, it isn't extreme anymore. It's quite mainstream. And I think the British people are going to summon up the courage to do it.
Now, I think it's nearly time to wrap up, so I've got one cheeky follow-up, and then we move to the gentleman over here with the final question. It's on this point of the EU money. So you obviously, I think you strike all of us as sort of a man of principle. Not everyone agrees with all of them, but you're very clearly a man of principle. So it is interesting to note that you've taken a different approach to someone like Sinn Féin. They win their seats in the UK Parliament. They don't take them up. They don't take the money. But you do take money from an organisation that you hate. So is it sort of a, do you enjoy the idea of using their money against them? Or does it feel like dirty money at all? What's the thinking behind that?
Let me tell you a story. The first Lisbon referendum in Ireland, I mean, the fact there was a second one, of course, is disgusting, but anyway, the first Lisbon referendum in Ireland, we used a big lump of our group's information budget from within the Parliament to send an 8-page glossy booklet through the Irish Post Office to every house in Ireland. And when the Irish voted no, the Taoiseach got up in Madoyle the next day and said Nigel Farage and a group of extremists from Strasbourg have hijacked Irish democracy. And I thought, yes, please. So, no, I'm really very happy to use the EU's money against it. I think it's terrific. I love the irony of it. We should jolly well go on doing so until we don't need to be here.
Excellent. And now to the final question, and then you're free, as are all of the audience.
I was enjoying it, but never mind.
Yes, thank you. No comments, just 2 questions, actually.
Yeah.
The first one, how much are you concerned that the UK will break up if you win the referendum?
That was asked earlier.
And the second, in foreign and security policy, which is essentially an intergovernmental policy, nothing is done without the UK consent, or indeed, in fact, with the UK drive. How much are you concerned that if the UK leaves, this policy will actually develop and driving potentially UK to irrelevance? As, in fact, for the last 3 centuries, the UK has tremendously well played the balance of powers in Europe. Thank you.
Okay, let's do the Scottish question, because that was hinted at by the Italian gentleman here. Okay, so the perception is the English hate the European Union and the Scottish love the European Union. Baloney. There is a difference. There are more English people prepared to leave at the moment than Scottish, but it's not massive. The gap isn't absolutely huge. And can you imagine how funny it would be if Britain votes to leave the European Union and the SNP then say, right, we as the Scottish National Party are going to hold a referendum against independence. We want you to vote to give your independence that's just been won away to Brussels. And I'm just not sure that will actually work. So I don't see, the threats of this to Scotland as being quite as great. Now, look, you make the argument about the British imbalance of power in Europe over centuries, and I completely understand that. But you can only hold the balance of power all the while you are genuinely independent. And whilst common foreign security policy may at this moment in time be subject to veto, you can't, if you're sitting in a different position, veto absolutely everything. I genuinely think that Britain's relationship with the rest of the world is much stronger than any other European country. It is just by very virtue of the Commonwealth, the Anglosphere, the things I touched on earlier. And I am determined that Britain should have its own independent common foreign and security policy. And maybe that way, if needed, we can use our traditional role under the balance of power to do the right thing.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you, Mr. Farage, for joining us. It's our tradition to give applause to anyone joining us for a Playbook Breakfast, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
A pleasure having you.
All right, that was really good.
Thanks to everyone who's been watching online and to all of you for taking an hour out of your morning to join us. We'll follow up again within the next month for the third Playbook Breakfast. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Thanks, Ram. Great. Brilliant.